presentation for Stony Brook Eastern Long Island Hospital, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Gold, who is going to be speaking on two subjects that are not related, but are very significant to a lot of people anyway: sinusitis and other sinus diseases, and snoring. And a lot of people have one or both of those conditions, or relatives with one or both of those conditions. So without any further ado, I will introduce Dr. Gold, and any questions for Dr. Gold, we will allow time at the end of the meeting for those questions to be taken. If for any reason somebody has a question that is urgent and they can't wait, we'll take the question right away. So, Dr. Gold.
Okay, I'm not going to use it. Okay. Okay. Hello. You know, it's a funny, sounds like they're not really related, but I think the way I'm thinking about it is we're really talking about the nose and throat. Yes? You can't hear me now? It's on. Can you hear me now? Yeah, good. Okay. So anyway, the way I'm sort of thinking about this is we're really talking about the nose and throat, and you'll see as we get into it. So let's start with the nose. The nose is a very important structure. It's the entrance to our respiratory system. It filters and cleans and humidifies the air that we breathe. It then rids itself of these contaminants and, germs that are inhaled. It provides the air for respiration and the oxygen that our bodies need to work. It also contains the olfactory organ, so it enables us to smell and to taste, actually, as well. And the other thing is that the nose is, I wrote connected to the sinuses, but really the sinuses are connected to the nose, and I'll go over that in a minute. So there are all kinds of noses, all different classifications. Some people not happy with their nose and they want to change it. Some people did just fine with their nose the way it was. So the external nose is made up of bone that comes out up here, and then there's two sets of cartilages. So the bottom of the nose is sort of squiggly, and the top of the is bony. The roof of the nose, the bone, is similar to the roof of a house, similar shape. The septum is the center wall of the nose, and it's made up of, it separates the two nostrils, made up of cartilage and bone. This is the side wall of the nose, and it's just showing real quickly, these structures are called the turbinates. We'll talk about them more. And so this is another view of the side wall of the nose, but those structures, the turbinates, have been removed. And I'm just showing this because it shows you what the sinuses look like. The sinus cavities are really like a labyrinth or a maze of little interconnected air spaces. And the mucus that they produce drains into the nose via this area here. Another perspective on the anatomy is this shows, didn't want to do that. This shows how the frontal sinus and the maxillary sinus is connected to the nose through that area that I was showing you before. So the way the sinuses work, the sinuses are a functioning organ, and what this is showing, this is just a diagram of so this is, let's look at this side. The eyeball would be here. This is the frontal sinus. This is the ethmoid sinus, which is that labyrinth we saw from another perspective, and this is the maxillary sinus. And what this diagram is showing is that the mucus is created in the sinuses and transported by the cilia up through these narrow spaces into the nose. And that mucus blanket, is what traps all the crud that we inhale. It's a major part of our immune system. So this is just an example of how, or an illustration of how it works. So this could be some area in the nose. This is a bony area. And these are the cilia, the little hair cells. And above the cilia is a mucus blanket. The way to look at it is like a carpet above, and the cilia just keep pushing it. So all the stuff that we inhale gets trapped on this mucus blanket, and eventually it's brought into our GI tract where it's destroyed. So let's talk about nasal congestion. So the most common form of nasal stuffiness is a viral upper respiratory infection, a cold, an allergy, a bacterial sinus infection, nasal polyps, a deviated septum, nasal valve, and enlarged turbinates. So these are really just the main, some of the main things that cause it. So in allergy, you know, the eyes are itchy, the nose is very boggy and swollen, draining a lot of liquid, it gets into the throat. So usually, but not always, it's pretty obvious what an infection is. Here you can see what a deviated septum is. So the center wall of the nose, instead of being straight, it goes to, usually there's one side that's concave and one side that's convex. This is called a C-shaped septum. Some people have an S-shaped septum. And then let's talk about nasal polyps. So nasal polyps are benign growths that usually emanate, not always, but usually emanate from the sinuses themselves. So this is the side wall of the nose, and you see these grape-like structures that fill the nose. And, you know, they get very big and swollen, and often it doesn't look like this. It looks more like this. All you would really see is a big swollen piece of what looks like a grape coming out of the nose. So it used to be thought that nasal polyps were very simple. They were from allergy, et cetera, et cetera. But now it turns out that the immunology of nasal polyps is very complicated. You know, we hear all these ads on TV for these new biologic drugs for, you know, rheumatoid arthritis, for inflammatory bowel disease. And there's one that's called Dupixent that's very big. It has two major indications. One is for psoriasis, but the other one is for nasal polyps. And the reason I want to show this is just showing the typical kind of inflammation from antihistamines and mast cells. But there are other mediators called interleukins. These are cytokines. These are these proteins in our body that control levels of inflammation. And it's now been shown that by treating people with this disease with certain biologics, you can interrupt the whole process. So what's significant about this is that most people who, there's something called the unified airway theory that says what goes on in the nose goes on in the lungs. So most of these patients also have severe asthma. And so just to mention that there's a complex immunology to polyps. You know, people could have surgery, and as some surgeons will say, sometimes they start coming back in the recovery room. So it really has to be a well thought out method of treatment. This is just showing what a nasal tumor, this would also cause nasal stuffiness, and you could just see this is the brain, these are the sinuses, and this is a malignant tumor. Another issue that causes nasal stuffiness is the turbinates. The turbinates are those structures in the side wall of the nose, and they're very involved with regulating airflow, moisture, and the temperature. And they do this by getting bigger and smaller. When we use something like Afrin nasal spray, these things shrink down, so we breathe very well. Decongestants do that. Nasal sprays, medicated sprays do that. Turbinate hypertrophy comes from many different things: allergy, pregnancy, and some people just have large turbinates, and they can be treated surgically or medically. Another quick one I'm going to mention for nasal obstruction is nasal valve collapse, and you can see this is a normal. These are this set of cartilages are the lower lateral cartilages. But on this side, you can see that this one is misplaced. So what happens here is the patient takes a deep breath and the nostril sucks in. And that's called nasal valve collapse. It's actually kind of difficult to correct, but correctable. So the concept of sinus pain and sinus headache is really sort of a misnomer, we should say. So sinus headache, you know, most people think when they have, or I shouldn't say most, many people when they have headache over the sinuses feel that they have an infection or something of that sort. But in reality, several things can cause headache over the face and over the sinuses. One is muscle spasm, which I'm going to get to in a minute, but migraine headaches, of course, can do that. Then we all know at times we're a human barometer, where we have the vacuum headache when the barometric chest pressure changes. So the air pressures are not equilibrating. This is similar to what happens on an airplane, sometimes in the ear. That's called ear barotrauma. Some people get sinus barotrauma when the plane descends. They get terrible facial pain and sometimes bleeding from the nose. Other things that cause it are high blood pressure and acid reflux, particularly silent reflux. Acid reflux without heartburn definitely causes facial pain and headache in a certain group of people. And often it's that sinus headache. I just want to say one thing about muscle spasm, muscle tension headache. So the concept of trigger points are areas in muscles and the fascia that surrounds the muscles where you get a nodule that is very irritated and tender and painful. And the hallmark with trigger points is that they sort of cause pain at another location. And this is what physical therapy and massage are based on. So just real quickly, so a lot of people that have forehead pain, really, so that wherever you see the red stuff, that's where you have pain. This is a great topic. There's so much on the internet about it, all over the body. You could have pain in a toe and it's coming from some area in your shin. You just have to rub and it goes away. It's so interesting. So here you see someone with, here, for example, frontal sinus pain. They have trigger points in the neck, in the sternocleidomastoid muscle. There are people that have pain along the side of the head or at the top of the head, and it's usually related to muscles in the area. A lot of people will have ear pain, TMJ pain, and it comes from a knot in the trapezius muscle in the neck. So it's very useful to think about this. So let's talk about sinus infections. So one way of looking at it is what's acute and what's chronic. So an acute infection, you get it, it goes away, and you don't get it again for a while. Chronic sinus infection is something that lasts for a period of weeks. Then there are people with chronic acute, where they have acute infections frequently. So they're sort of similar, not exactly the same, but typically people with a sinus infection will have stuffy nose, frequently yellow to green nasal drainage, often facial pain and headache, often the upper teeth hurt because the upper teeth are the floor of the maxillary sinus. And then loss of smell and taste is very common, and then a cough. So just one thing about the cough, this actually can cause a picture that looks exactly like asthma, except when the sinus problem goes away, that goes away as well. So this is part of this unified airway theory. You know, a lot of the medicines that we use for the nose, the sprays, are the exact same sprays that are used for inhalers for the lungs. The names are just changed a little bit, and the dispensers are changed a little bit, but the drugs are virtually the same because it's a very similar organ and they really work together. So what kind of etiology do we have with sinus infections? So the most typical infection is viral, but what frequently happens, and I'll show in a minute, a typical story for an acute sinus infection is to have a viral infection and it gets better. And then 3 or 4 days later, boom, patient has a bacterial infection. And I'll show you why in a minute. And typically, you know, with the bacterial infection, patients get the drainage, the loss of smell, things of that sort. And then just a word about, a word about fungal infections. So real fungal infections don't really occur, invasive fungal infections don't really occur in normal people. They occur in immunocompromised people. And there's something called mucormycosis. These are infections that almost act like tumors, like cancers. And patients are dreadfully sick, often need surgery to remove areas of the bone and sinuses. But In general, though, there was thinking about 15, 20 years ago, there was research that came out of the Mayo Clinic, and they were saying that they discovered mold in everybody's nose, and that maybe chronic sinusitis was from fungus. So this has really been kind of disproved. The idea was that there were these blood cells called eosinophils that we find in patients with nasal polyps, and we used to think that that meant there was some type of an allergy or a reaction to the fungus going on. But I showed you in the other slide about the interleukins and the cytokines, that that's really more of an immunological problem where the body pumps out these cells called eosinophils. So if you see these ads on television, they'll be talking about eosinophilic asthma, and there are many drugs for that, and it's very similar to what we're using in the nose now for nasal polyps. So real quick, this slide is showing the cycle of sinusitis. So let's start over here. So again, you see these are the eyeballs, these are the sinuses, and the sinuses basically drain into the little areas of the nose. So someone gets a cold, a viral rhinitis, and maybe they have a deviated septum or something else that helps block it. So if they have something happens that the sinuses get inflamed, the nasal cavity, I should say, gets inflamed, and then the mucus that's should be very thin and healthy that goes around to cleanse our nose, it gets stuck and it stagnates. And the pH changes, gases form, the cilia, as hair cells, and the lining tissue are damaged. And this causes a medium for bacterial growth. And this is really what's considered to be the mechanism of bacterial sinusitis. So what happens is you get more and more swelling, more and more infection, and then the ostium, the area gets more and more closed. So that's the cycle leading to sinusitis. So clinically, typically a patient with a maxillary sinusitis, if it's a maxillary sinus, usually the pain is located over the site of the sinus. It can go back towards the ear. Some people get pain up here as well. But people typically have pain behind the eyes. This is not usually considered an emergency. I'll tell you why I'm saying that in a minute. But this usually responds to antibiotics. A more dangerous form of acute sinusitis is of the frontal sinus. So the frontal sinus is the one in the forehead. Pain here usually is over there, but it could fool you. It could also be here. The pain can go here. This is considered potentially an emergency because there's a relatively, shouldn't say relatively, but there's a much higher incidence of meningitis when someone gets a frontal sinus infection just due to the anatomy. This is a picture inside the nose with an endoscope of what acute sinusitis looks like, and you can see all the pus. Here's another one. So this is the septum, this is the turbinate, this is the lateral wall, and this is typically what you're seeing in a bad sinus infection. So we typically would use a little swab and take a culture of this, so we know what the main bacteria is. And this is a CT scan of a patient like that with a left-sided sinusitis. So on the right, excuse me, it's left-right confusion. On the right side of the X-ray, we see all this cloudy stuff, and that's all pus. On the left side of this CAT scan, we see air, which is black. So this is a really good example of a patient with sinus infection here and clear here. And this is just a little cyst in the sinus. It's not really considered a polyp. It's a cyst, and it's of no consequence. Okay, so the treatment for sinusitis is typically antibiotics. There was an article published a few years ago in the family practice literature saying you don't need to treat sinus infections, and I don't necessarily agree with that. If it means a patient has a cold and you don't treat them right away, that's fine. But if someone has a bacterial sinus infection, we believe in treatment. So oral antibiotics are typically used. Sometimes nasal steroids are used. Sometimes oral steroids are used to decrease the inflammation. What happens with the sinuses, with or without polyps, is that the tissues in the nose become so swollen that they act like a barricade. and you have to do something to shrink them. And the nasal tissue and polyps are exquisitely sensitive to oral steroids like prednisone. So unfortunately or fortunately, it's part of the treatment of severe sinusitis. And the other thing I wanted just to throw out there and mention is that acid reflux, particularly silent acid reflux, that's where acid and the stomach contents go into the throat and then aerosolize and get into the nose. This is all proven by research. And what happens is the acid and the enzymes that get into the nose affect the cilia and the functioning and the cleansing of the nose. So acid reflux is a major, major cause of sinus infections. And the treatment for acid reflux is not just medication. The primary effective treatment for acid reflux is diet. Unfortunately, this often is not followed by physicians or patients, but that is the treatment. The primary treatment is diet. Two procedures. The first one is called balloon sinuplasty, not really surgery. So let me just show you, and the other is science. I'm going to show you quick. So what balloon sinuplasty is, this is a procedure, a technology that probably we're using now for about 10 or 15 years. And basically, if a patient, here, this is showing how this sinus is blocked. You see it's very narrow here. So this is done in the office under local anesthesia, no sedation. It's very easy to get people numb for this. And then we take a device, and there's a balloon that comes out of the device, so we get it into the area that's blocked. We inflate the balloon, deflate the balloon, inflate the balloon, and remove it, and the area stays open. So this has been a tremendous, tremendous thing for patients with recurrent sinus infections, usually without polyps, who don't really need to have surgery. And then, of course, you know, surgery is not without its consequences, and some people go on with problems with their sinuses, and then you don't really know, is it from the surgery, et cetera. So the balloon sinuplasty has been a tremendous thing for us. Again, this is the frontal sinus, showing how the frontal sinus was blocked. So the balloon goes up, we do a few dilatations, remove it, and then it looks something like this. This is a CT scan of a patient with sinusitis. And basically, these are the eyes. So there's some air in the sinuses. You can see this stuff here is, imagine the wallpaper in the room getting very, very thick. This is a normal area of sinus. All you see is the black air against the white bone, but there is a lining tissue there, and as it gets infected, it looks more and more like this. So traditionally, this would be a patient who would have sinus surgery, but quite frankly, I think most of us would attempt balloon sinuplasty in this patient, because often by just opening up this area, the other sinuses will return to health. So basically, when we do surgery, so this is the sinus, as I showed you this picture before. This is that labyrinth. It's all very narrow spaces. But what we try to accomplish in sinus surgery is to remove all the diseased tissue, but it's still considered a minimally invasive procedure. So basically, all the diseased tissue is removed. We make sure the sinuses that connect to the nose are opening. So this is what we're trying to achieve in sinus surgery. And this is a picture of one of my patients, which I think is such a great picture. So this is a patient who had only one-sided problems. Sinus, so you see on this side, on the right side of the picture, the sinuses were very complicated, all these little passages, but for some reason, she didn't get sick on this side. So we only operated on this side. So this side looked like this, but this is what you're going for. So what we're doing is we want to remove all the diseased tissue and have wide openings so this is a good surgical result. Okay, so let's move on to snoring. Snoring is the hoarse or harsh sound that occurs when air flows past relaxed tissues in the throat, causing the tissues to vibrate. Nasal congestion or nasal obstruction can contribute to snoring, but it's rarely the cause of snoring. The causes of snoring are multiple. One is sleep apnea. It's really more of a continuum, which we'll get into as the snoring gets worse and there's more difficulty moving air, then the patients often will pass into the obstructive sleep apnea category. But not everyone who snores has sleep apnea. I'm sure a lot of people are aware that, that many people, if they take a sleeping pill or they drink alcohol, they snore like crazy. And that's really the only time they snore. It relaxes all the muscles. Smoking causes inflammation, does the same. Head and neck anatomy, this has to do with the shape of the chin, the shape of the nose, the shape of the neck. Patients with chronic nasal congestion also more likely to snore. And the position that you sleep in. If you sleep on your back, it's more likely to have it. Most people who snore and have apnea, but not all, are overweight. And a lot of people, if they lose weight, they do better, but that's easier said than done. So one cause for snoring in the throat are the tonsils. Now, this is not typical for adults because adults either have their tonsils removed or as we get older, the tonsils generally shrivel away. So some adults, you don't even know if they've had surgery. The tonsils just tend to go away. So when you have something like this, it's wide open, but this adds to more tissue in the back of the throat, and this itself could contribute to snoring. So in younger people, that's usually more of a consideration. But this is the main thing, is the tongue position. So this is what really it's all about. So when you look at a patient, just with a flashlight, this is a classification done by Dr. Friedman in Chicago. And basically, this is a class 1. This is normal, normal, normal. So you have a big space between the top of the tongue and the palate. Then class 2, the tongue is higher and bulkier. Class 3, and then class 4, you can't see the palate at all. So these are much more apt to be seen in patients with sleep apnea. So if you want to look at this, you see, so normal breathing, let me just show you. So this is the tongue, and this is the palate, and this is the nose. So this is showing that normally the air, the blue air, goes in, it passes the soft palate, it passes the tongue, and goes into our trachea and into our respiratory system. For people with snoring, it's a matter of partial obstruction. So you can see that the palate is floppier, the tongue is bigger, but you could still get some air through. But with obstructive sleep apnea, you have complete obstruction. And here you can see I think my light went out. Okay. Anyway, you can see the pharynx is obstructed. So some of the things that help with snoring are sleeping on your side. They have devices. This is a belt. You can put it around your chest, keep you from lying on your back. An old wives' tale was to sew a pocket into the back of a pajama shirt and put a tennis ball in it, or a red rubber ball. Works very well. People take and search for nasal dilators, which I don't think really help that much. They help with the breathing. So there's all kinds of nasal dilators that are available. They often will advertise that they're good for snoring. But what's very good for snoring is an oral appliance, and I'm going to talk about this more in a minute. But the oral appliance is a two-piece appliance, and basically what it does, it's adjusted so that it pulls the jaw forward. So let me show you how you snore, right? But I'm going to put my jaw forward. I can't snore, since it's pulling my base of my tongue forward, and this is a very good factor that we try to use in treating people with snoring and sleep apnea. The chin strap works for many people. It repositions it, and a lot of people can do this. It helps them with their snoring. There's a procedure known as the pillar procedure. It was invented about 20 years ago. Personally, I didn't see great results with it, but it's still done. And it's for those people where the real main area is coming from their palate. They get a fluttering in their palate. So this is a device that's injected into the palate, and it scarifies the palate. It stays there and roughens up the tissue so it becomes less floppy. But I think this really only addresses the issue in a very small number of people. This is something I just discovered. I thought it was great. This is a device called Smart Nora, and what it is there is under the pillow, there's a bladder, an air bladder, And there's a sensor, so when the person stops breathing, it starts vibrating their head gently, and it makes them move. And I think this is really clever. I haven't used it with any patients, but I think it makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is the most common sleep-related breathing disorder. It causes you to start and stop breathing all night. There are a couple of types of sleep apnea. One is called central, one is mixed, but we're talking here mostly about obstructive sleep apnea. And this is when the throat muscles intermittently relax and block the airway during sleep. So the complications of sleep apnea are primarily daytime fatigue, but that can lead to a lot of problems: irritability, difficulty concentrating, motor vehicle accidents, poor work performance. It also leads to high blood pressure and stroke. Obstructive sleep apnea creates severe cardiovascular problems. The incidence of heart attack, congestive heart failure, cardiac arrhythmia, atrial fibrillation, and sudden death. So there are so many people now who are tested and treated for sleep apnea by their cardiologists, because it's now known what a big problem this is for people with cardiac disease. It can also lead to type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and also it leads to complications with normal medications and surgeries. So I'm sorry that I don't have the pointer, but anyway, you can see on the left, the blue arrow is showing this is a non-obstructed airway. You see the tongue and the palate, and there's a nice airway there. But on the other side, everything is obstructed. The tongue is almost touching the posterior pharyngeal wall. The palate is all squished in like that. And what this does is this. So this is a non-obstructed person, and the blue dots are fresh air, and the red dots are carbon dioxide, used air. So here you can see the fresh air comes in, and the carbon dioxide comes out. When somebody has complete obstruction, you can see how the oxygen can't get into the airway, and then the carbon dioxide stays in the lungs, and this leads to very serious health problems. The symptoms of sleep apnea: excessive sleepiness, snoring, pauses in breathing, headache, difficulty concentrating, and very typically high blood pressure. When patients are tested for sleep apnea, they have a sleep study. It measures their brain waves, their oxygen level, heart rate, breathing rate, and also leg movements, looking for restless leg syndrome. So what does the sleep study tell us? It tells us how long you spend in each sleep stage, how often you wake up, whether you stop breathing or have trouble breathing, whether you snore, what position you snore in, limb movements, and any unusual brain activity. So the sleep study generates a value called the AHI. It's called the Apnea-Hypopnea Index. A similar measurement is called the Respiratory Distress Index, and they're basically very similar. And what it is, it's the number of apneas or hypopneas, that means missed breaths or ineffective breaths that you have per hour. So they take the number of episodes and divide it by the number of hours you slept, and you get a number. So people who have fewer than 5 events are considered normal. People between 5 and 15 are considered mild. People who have an AHI of 15 to 29 are moderate, and severe is 30 or more. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is when you're looking at these things, you also follow the oxygen desaturation. There are people who their oxygen goes very, very low in their blood, and this is very dangerous, and this is probably one of the main reasons that lead to arrhythmias and sudden death, I would think. So let's talk briefly about the treatment for sleep apnea. One is CPAP. Another is an oral appliance. I'll go through these and I'll show you. So the CPAP is, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, it's a device that generates a positive pressure, and usually it's a mask on the face, and it just provides enough pressure to pass by the obstruction in the hypopharynx. Today, the nasal pillows is probably the most common type of sleep mask that people are using, but it's still, it's still not great, but much better than before. The oral appliance, very important for sleep apnea. Many, many people are managed with an oral appliance. It's obviously a lot easier and less cumbersome than using CPAP. This is just showing how, I don't know if you can see that, but the oral appliance is pulling the lower jaw forward, and that's pulling the tongue forward and pulls it back away from the pharynx, and that's what I was demonstrating before. This is a slide that I only realized today is not what I thought it was, but I'm going to talk. So this is really about oral appliance as well, but I also want to show you that there are surgeries that can be done. One is an oral type surgery where the oral surgeon lengthens the lower jaw. So most people with sleep apnea will have a smallish jaw, and that leads to a high tongue base because the jaw is not being pulled out. A mandibular surgery is done to pull the jaw forward, and that brings the tongue with it. There's also a procedure, or a few procedures, that the ENT doctors do where you drill a hole into the jaw, and you put something like a wire in. It grabs the back of the tongue, and then you anchor it. So you actually can pull the base of the tongue towards the front of the jaw, and that's done in extreme cases. Sometimes lasers are done to remove some of the bulky tissue in the back of the jaw, and that's done under general anesthesia, and that is quite painful post-operatively. And then the newest thing is Inspire. So Inspire is a very exciting invention, and what it is, it's a pacemaker for sleep apnea. So it's a standard type pacemaker. It's implanted in the chest. The wire on the bottom is also under the skin, and what it's doing is it's sensing the breathing. And when the patient takes a breath, the pacemaker fires, and it's implanted on the hypoglossal nerve. That's the nerve that energizes the tongue. So with a little bit of an electric current, when the patient wants to take a breath, it stimulates the tongue contracts and gets smaller, and allows normal respiration. So this is really an amazing, amazing thing. And this has really only been available over the last few years. It's now becoming popular. You may have seen the ads on TV for it. And basically, this is not for everybody. It's people that have failed using CPAP. They can only be of a certain size. They have to have a certain AHI or RDI. And then they have to have something called a sleep endoscopy, where while they're sleeping, the ear, nose, and throat doctor does an endoscopy to determine the areas of maximum narrowness, because this only works if it's in the right spot. So anyway, so that's basically it. So this is from snoring to sleep apnea, really sort of similar. There's so many people with undiagnosed sleep apnea that it's really, really frightening. And that's it. Can I answer any questions? Yes. It's the same thing. Yeah, rhino just saying the nose, but if you have a sinus infection, it's sort of got to be in your nose. So it's really not different. It's like the name of our specialty is otolaryngology. In some places, it's otorhinolaryngology. I think it's just, but rhinosinusitis is a sinus infection. Okay? Okay. Well, oh, yes. I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
If you experience some of the issues that you have mentioned here,
what sort of a physician do you go to first? It sounds like quite a labyrinth of techniques to help you that would be hard to know how to sort that out.
Well, there, a lot of things we do with medicine are approached from different areas. Hand surgery, some of the hand surgeons are general surgeons who've done fellowships in hand surgery. Some are plastic surgeons, some are orthopedics. So basically, I think depending on this, probably most people with sleep apnea should see an ENT doctor and a sleep specialist. Now, some ENT doctors are also speech specialists. I'm not. I'm a general otolaryngologist. In my practice, I usually have my patients see a sleep specialist. Usually they come from the world of pulmonology. There was a time, for some strange reason, they came from the world of psychiatry in the old days. I'm not sure why that was. But now most of the speech, not all, but most of the sleep specialists are pulmonologists. So I think for, most people probably both would help, but the vast majority of people don't need any kind of surgical or specific intervention aside from CPAP, which is usually prescribed by the medical sleep specialist.
We have a question from the chat. They were wondering if they should continue to use their Philips CPAP that's been recalled. I believe was what the question.
Well, I know about it. I don't have much to say about it. Yeah. So this recall is just disastrous, but apparently there was a part in the device that foam that can become carcinogenic. It's just mind-boggling that something like that could happen. But I don't think there's an easy fix for it. I don't know exactly what's happening, but the patients who have those are advised not to use them. Yes?
If you had a sleep test, and it shows that you're kind of got a minor sleep apnea problem, does that require some kind of intervention, or at what stage of that hierarchy do you need to be considering intervention?
Well, I think that, I'll tell you, I'm not answering it directly, but I'll tell you what Medicare does, just from that point of view. So, so we were talking about the apnea-hypopnea index of less than 5 is normal. So anybody with an AHI or an RDI of 15 or more automatically, we'll talk about the patients, automatically will be covered by Medicare for CPAP. But if someone has an RDI of 5, from 6 to 14, so they're not really in that category, and then there's 3 or 4 factors that will let them get it. Excessive daytime sleepiness, cardiovascular problems, and insomnia. I think there's one more I'm just missing. So that's how they look at it. I mean, it's like I see so many patients who have hearing tests. So the audiologist will tell them, okay, you need hearing aids, and hearing aids are very, very important for people. But on the other hand, what I tell my patients is everybody's brain is different with hearing, and there are people who have a mild hearing loss who must use hearing aids because otherwise everyone's mumbling to them, they don't hear a thing. And then there are people who you do the hearing test and it's a lot worse, but they're really doing fine. So I think it's the same kind of common sense with this. I mean, I feel that patients who have like an AHI of 15, 16, 17, who don't have desaturation of the oxygen in their blood, I'm not sure it's crucial, but I'm not an expert on that. You see patients who have AHIs of 30, 40, One thing, though, that I have learned is that there are patients who have severe sleep apnea and an oral appliance could still work because it depends if it works with their anatomy. So there are people who use an oral appliance who have apnea and they do fine. Then there are people that have sleep disordered breathing, not quite as bad, but they snore and they use CPAP even though maybe they don't have to. So I think it has to be a tailor-made like everything else, I think you have to really look at the individual. Yes, sir.
Where do you go to get your AHI reading done?
Well, that's a sleep study. It's also called polysomnography. So usually that's done, it's done differently. So the full polysomnography is with the EEG leads for the brain and all kinds of things like that. And that's usually done in a hospital setting or in a sleep center affiliated with a hospital.
And someone would have to refer you to that?
Yes, yes.
What would that look
Well, a general doctor could do it if they suspect you have it. Cardiologists could do it, ENT. But then there's a lot of home sleep studies today. And this is, I think, largely, first of all, it's much more convenient. It's very difficult to, to sort of sleep in a strange place and try to mimic what you do in real life. But also, there's a tremendous cost difference. So I think that the general feeling about home sleep studies for most people is that they're adequate, or maybe more than adequate. And that generates an AHI also. Anything else? Okay. Thank you very much.
Very enlightening, thorough discussion of the issues that you covered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good job. All right, so we're done.
Covered a lot of territory.
A lot of slides. How long did it, how long?